There have been advances in medications. Today, the medications that are typically used are called atypical antipsychotics because they're not like the original antipsychotics. They tend to have many fewer side effects, although they do have some risks. One of the first atypical antipsychotics was called clozapine, and one of its side effects, called agranular cytosis, you'll win a trivia contest for remembering that term, caused a dramatic drop in white blood cell count over a matter of just a few hours, and so the person could easily die from an opportunistic infection. But that tended to happen only in the first few weeks, and once you got past the first few weeks, it was rarely a problem. So it required a lot of care. The newer drugs have fewer side effects, and they tend to do a better job of improving the symptoms. But they do something that the earlier class of drugs never did, and that is improve the clarity of thought in individuals with psychotic disorders. Prior to drug treatment, there was virtually no treatments that worked. Frieda from Reichmann and a couple of other unusual people had demonstrated that intensive psychotherapy under their direction helped some patients, not many, but some. But almost no one could pull that off. And so psychotherapy seemed like a waste of time. Once the medications were developed, an early study looked at medications versus psychotherapy, and they found that psychotherapy had no effect, and that when you had medications, adding psychotherapy had no effect. The only effect you had is if you took medications, you tended to do better. So the popular wisdom was psychotherapy is of no value in the treatment of schizophrenia. Now that popular wisdom proved not to be correct. Aaron Beck, who you'll learn about later because he's done a lot of research with cognitive behavioral therapy in the treatment of depression, argued that it seems that if cognitive behavioral therapy can work for some disorders, like anxiety disorders and mood disorders, why not schizophrenia? And it turns out he's right, to a degree. Where you can change the way people with depression think about something in a matter of days or weeks with cognitive behavioral therapy, it might take many months to do the same thing with people who have schizophrenia. And if you make those changes, you don't stop the symptoms the way you do with, say, treating depression, but rather you get the patient to hide the symptoms. So with cognitive behavioral therapy, you can get patients with schizophrenia to realize that when they hear a voice and they can't see anyone, that's got to be a hallucination. It's not a real voice. And so you can teach them not to talk to that voice. Now, as I said before, the symptoms are still there. They're still hearing the voice. But if they don't talk to it, the people around them don't know that the symptoms are there. And that allows the patient to be able to carry on a more normal life, perhaps even have a job. In the long history of schizophrenia, families have gotten a bad rap. They've been accused of being responsible for the symptoms in the first place. The mother drove their kids to be psychotic, the schizophrenic mother hypothesis, or the family members put the children in double binds. And expressed emotion can make the symptoms of schizophrenia worse. The truth is, if you have a sibling or a child with schizophrenia, that is enormously stressful. People with schizophrenia often behave in bizarre ways. It can be very embarrassing if the person with the disorder is a relative of yours. If you're 12 years old and your 18-year-old brother starts talking gibberish and crazy ideas when your friends come over, Your friends are going to wonder about you, and you're going to be embarrassed. In family therapy, that's effective. What you do is you reduce the expressed emotion, but you do it by supporting the family. You tell them how difficult it is to have a family member with a disorder. How difficult it is when you love that person to not be able to do anything to help them. And instead what you do is you show them how they can have some impact on their child or their sibling, and how they can take care of themselves from the unique stresses of having someone in your family have schizophrenia. This works. It makes it better for the family members, and it can reduce the expressed emotion, and in that way make it better for the individuals who have schizophrenia. At one time, most patients with schizophrenia spent their whole life in a hospital and therefore had very few social interactions with anyone other than hospital staff or other patients with the disorder. That happens less now, but most patients with schizophrenia either don't want to be in social relationships because they have a schizoid pattern, or their behavior is such that most people don't want to be in a social relationship with them because, well, their behavior is kind of crazy. If you're not in social relationships, you never learn how to engage in social relationships. If, unlike me, high school was a long time ago for me, if high school wasn't that long ago, you probably remember what it was like being a freshman the first day of high school, and what it was like being a senior later on. You are a lot cooler as a senior than you were as a freshman, right? You were a lot better at handling social relationships as a senior than you were as a freshman. Imagine what would have happened if suddenly you started your freshman year and for 4 years you never had any social relations. You would never learn how to be more socially sophisticated. So as a senior, you'd be about as socially sophisticated as a new freshman. And that would be bad. Well, patients with schizophrenia don't get the experience with social relationships, and so they are often unable to handle them. But social relationships can be learned. So social therapy teaches people with schizophrenia to be more effective in social relationships. Essentially, you're tutoring them how to handle social relationships. That increases their social support. That decreases their social stress. When you blow a social relationship, it's very uncomfortable, and that discomfort increases your stress. Deinstitutionalization was introduced in the early 1970s, and it was based on a very simple idea. Any individuals who are institutionalized for a long period of time never do the things that you have to do outside of the institution. If you're a prisoner, for example, you go to bed when they say to go to bed, and you get up when they say to get up, and you go outside and exercise when they say to do that, and you eat when they say to do that, etc. You don't make any decisions for yourself. You don't buy your own food. You don't make your own meals. The same is true in a psychiatric hospital. And after a while, you reach the point where you really can't do anything for yourself. That's not good. That's called institutionalization. And because it's not good, you don't want to do it. Well, since most individuals with schizophrenia typically had spent their entire life in the hospital, they were all institutionalized, which meant that they couldn't do a lot of things in the real world. So we wanted to reduce that effect, and the way we did it is we moved them out of the hospital so they weren't institutionalized. Unfortunately, we didn't have a clue of how to do it. So typically the way it was done is you would give the patient 2 bus tokens, and enough money to buy lunch. And at 7 in the morning, you would send them on their way, and they couldn't come back before, say, 4:30 in the afternoon. They needed a place to sleep, so they slept in the hospital, but basically they couldn't be in the hospital because, well, that was bad. Well, sending them off on the bus wasn't very good either. Now, I have some firsthand experience with it because I started graduate school in 1972, and I had an apartment about 3 miles from campus that happened to be on a bus route that was about halfway between the state psychiatric hospital and the campus. So when I would get on the bus, usually I caught the bus that went by my apartment around 7:10 in the morning. Typically, half of the people on the bus had the diagnosis of schizophrenia. They were easy to spot because the secondary symptoms of the medications they were on created all kinds of things that were easy to observe, and they were often hallucinating and talking to their hallucinatory voices. It didn't work very well because they had no place to go. Some of them would just get a transfer ticket and go to another bus and keep doing that for 8 or 9 hours and finally take a bus back to the psychiatric hospital, have dinner, and sleep in the psychiatric hospitals. Others would get off the bus and go to the library, but they often got thrown out because of their behavior, or they'd go to a store and they were often thrown out of that. The result was disastrous. Now, I'm proud to say that deinstitutionalization started with hospitals in the Madison, Wisconsin area where I was a graduate student, but the improved process also started there because it wasn't long before it was clear this wasn't working. The improved process involves creating an environment that is supportive of the individual, but is not an institution, that allows the individual to live independently and develop the skills that are required to live independently, but also to have the support that they need to manage their symptoms. We'll talk about what that system is in just a minute. About the same time that deinstitutionalization occurred, there was a growth in programs called community mental health centers. They were part of the Great Society programs of the 1960s that continued into the 1970s. They were taxpayer-supported clinics that usually provided free or almost free psychotherapy to people who needed it. But when deinstitutionalization happened, these clinics were often the only places where people with schizophrenia could go, and so they became essentially de facto day programs for the individuals who had essentially been thrown out, at least for the day, from the psychiatric hospitals. These mental health centers often collapsed because of that, because other people wouldn't come to them. Some of them became specialists in particular areas. Many of the drug treatment programs that we have were actually community mental health centers that started specializing in drug treatment and eventually got so good at it that they didn't need government support to be able to support their staff. Some of those community mental health centers experimented with how they could work with the psychiatric patients who spent their evenings in a psychiatric hospital, but their days hanging around the community mental health center. And that was the impetus for developing programs called partial hospitalization or day programs. These were programs that provided the activities and social interaction that was important to keep people with schizophrenia reasonably healthy. Also provided the medication management so that these individuals could often live in the community with the kind of support that they were getting during the day. Now, unfortunately, people with schizophrenia, that's a chronic condition. And although most of them spend most of their time not in the hospital, occasionally their symptoms get out of control and they require brief hospitalizations. But instead of the hospitalizations lasting for years or decades, they would last a few days or a few weeks until they were stabilized again and then released to the kinds of programs that were available in the community. Now, these programs were not cheap. They weren't quite as expensive as hospitals, but they were not cheap. And without them, the individuals really couldn't stay out of the hospital. Now, if you can provide programs that during the day produce the support that is needed to maintain people who have a diagnosis like schizophrenia, that's a good step towards deinstitutionalization, for eliminating at least much of the need for hospitalization. But they still need a place to sleep at night. And generally, that's done these days with halfway houses. Now, some people with schizophrenia will live with their families, but you can't imagine, if you don't have a family member with schizophrenia, how difficult it can be, how much of a strain it is on a family. So most people with schizophrenia do not live for decades with their families. Instead, they typically live in supervised residence or halfway houses, sometimes called group homes. Now, it's not just people with schizophrenia. People who are released from prison often will be in a group home for a while. People with intellectual dysfunction often will live in group homes and attend various programs during the day. Group homes are very effective, but they're hard to set up for something called NIMBY, which stands for Not in My Backyard. People don't want group homes next to them. And the whole idea of group homes is you want them to be in the community like any other residence. Now, there's a realistic reason why you would not want a group home next to you. Many people will not buy a house that's next door to a group home, which means when you go to sell your house, there's going to be fewer people who will be interested in buying. And supply and demand means if there are fewer buyers, the price is going to be lower. And in fact, the price is lower. That's realistic. The unrealistic reason is that many people fear that individuals with schizophrenia are dangerous, that they might kill someone. On average, people with schizophrenia are less dangerous than randomly selected people. Now, a few are dangerous, but it's a very small minority who are. So that's an unrealistic expectation. So in summary, the symptoms of psychosis are varied, and they fall into several categories: positive, negative, disorganized. But in general, you can think of psychosis as a loss of contact with reality. People with psychosis don't know what's real and what's not real. Schizophrenia, probably the best known of the psychoses, affect one person in hundreds, in 100, about 1% of the population. Tends to be very chronic. Genes seem to be a major contributor, but not the sole contributor. There are obviously things in the environment that can cause some people with the genes to develop the disorder and others not. The primary way we treat psychotic conditions now is with medications. But we try to avoid hospitalization because of its negative effects, treating patients in the community with day programs and providing residence in the community for most of the patients to live.